Good morning, and welcome to the second of SPG's two-part webinar series on alternative pulse crops. My name is Mark Satilny, and I'm going to be hosting our discussion today. For those of you who are joining us live, if you provided a CCA number at the time of registration, SPG will be applying for CEUs on your behalf. That will all be taken care of. Today, we'll also be using Slido. So if you haven't used this before, it's really easy to set up, and you just go onto the internet, go to slido.com. Our event code for today is 1176581. And through this, you'll then be able to join the event and ask questions or participate in any live polls that we have going on. At the end of each of the two crops that I'll be covering today, the fava beans and soybeans, we will do a live question and answer discussion period. So if you have any questions, you can just enter it into that Q&A tab in Slido, and I will answer them to the best of my ability or point you in the right direction. So as I said, I am Mark Satilny. I'm an agronomy manager with SPG, along with my colleague Mike Brown. If any of you were on the presentation yesterday, you'll have seen him presenting on the dry beans and chickpeas. Primarily, we kind of focus on different areas of the province and different crops. So for me, I focus on pea, fava bean, and soybean, which mainly takes me kind of to the north and east of the province. Mike is focusing on lentil, chickpeas, and dry beans, which typically takes him more to the south and the west of the province, but obviously kind of with different environmental conditions and soil zones, we kind of intermingle in all of those. But if you ever have any questions relating to any of those kind of crops, then definitely reach out to us, and we are here to help you with that. All right, so now we'll get into soybeans. So again, for this one, we'll go over those growing areas, production and yields, and the agronomy section covering the varieties, feeding, field management, insects, diseases, and harvest. And then finally, those markets and uses for growing soybeans in Saskatchewan. So as you can see here, it is very much focused in that southeast corner. That is really kind of how it's trickled in from Manitoba, where in the south of Manitoba, they grow a lot of soybeans. So we are kind of following into that, where it is able to grow under those conditions. It does, as most people know, kind of need those longer growing days and more heat. So that's kind of a good area for it with all the moisture as well. Good thing with soybeans is insurance is available for soybeans all over the province. So as long as you are selecting the proper varieties and have good growing conditions, then that is an option for growers. The seeded acres compared to Canada, super small. So we know Manitoba, Ontario, those are really the big ones. Quebec, we only have a little portion of that. At that 67,000 acres, we did drop from 68,000 in 2023. And Manitoba has really the most in the West, with almost 1.5 million acres. So we are very much a small portion of that in the Western provinces. As for just kind of focusing in on Saskatchewan, so again, teensy tiny little portion, 67,000 acres. New varieties continue to be developed, and really the hope is to see that those acres are able to be increased, especially because of some of the benefits that this crop really provides in a grower's rotation, as well as the very kind of stable and developed market for soybeans. That is another benefit that we do not have to start from scratch for the market in soybeans. We know that they are very easy to sell. Here, kind of looking at the regional variability of the different yields across the province. So on an average, tenure is 25 bushels per acre. This past year, we had a nice 30 bushels per acre. It's all just kind of dependent on the year. You can see pretty stable across the areas that it is grown. As for some of the agronomy, so here again is just that nice quick snapshot of growing soybeans. So one of the big key things for the areas that it's able to be grown is that it is non-host for Aphanomyces. So if you have been struggling that with your rotation of peas and lentils, this can be a really good option because it is not going to be impacted by the Aphanomyces and it is not going to contribute to increasing the pathogen in the soil. Also with soybeans, they do have a lot more alternative herbicide and fungicide options compared to like when I was talking about faba beans. It has a lot of the same chemicals with peas and lentils, whereas soybean has different options to be able to kind of break up the products that you're using and prevent any kind of weed and disease resistance. Soybeans also are kind of a bit of a longer maturing crop. So depending on what other crops you have in your rotation and in your various fields, you are kind of able to manage your time a little bit better by including a crop like soybeans. And as I said, the market well established. It's very easy to sell soybeans. It is just a matter of continuing to develop these varieties that are better adapted to Saskatchewan and increasing those acres. For the varieties that are available to growers, so there are the conventional and the herbicide tolerant ones. The vast majority are glyphosate tolerant. Those are what the majority of growers grow, but there are conventional varieties available. And really, depending on which one a grower chooses, you could have that 100 to 130 day maturity, 25 to 38 bushels per acre yield. It's all very dependent on where you're growing and the conditions that the crop has. As for seeding, so soybeans are a bit more temperamental than other crops. They do require warmer soils around that 10 degrees Celsius. When you compare it to the faba beans that were able to do 3 to 5, this does require it to be warmed up a little bit. One of the big things that I know Manitoba does is with their trash management, where they will kind of get the soil fully black just because then it warms up quicker. In Saskatchewan, that's not always the best option depending on where you are for water management and all of that. But that is something that kind of other provinces are doing to increase that soil temperature so you can get into the ground a little bit earlier. Another thing that soybeans are sensitive to is a late spring frost. So once the growing point gets above the ground after it germinates, it can then be really hit hard by a frost. As long as it stays underground, it's pretty resistant. But as soon as it gets above the ground, that's when a frost can really be detrimental to it. There's also sensitive to cold water. So it really, through and through, it just does not like to be cold. So when the seed is actually planted in the ground and starts to germinate, it will take about 50% of its weight in water to initiate that emergence. So if that rainwater or runoff water is still very cold, below that 10 degrees Celsius kind of soil temperature, then that can be detrimental to the germination of the seed. Another thing to remember with soybeans is inoculant is critical, as the soil we have in Saskatchewan doesn't have that native bradyrhizobium in it. So you do need to apply it to either the seed or granular or peat or however you want to do it. But it is very important to inoculate your soybeans, and there's no harm in doing a dual inoculation where seed applied and soil applied to really make sure that you have that bradyrhizobium to induce the nodulation and really provide the nitrogen fixation that the crop requires. Another thing that the soybeans is sensitive about is fertilizers such as phos. So when I was talking about faba beans, that it can take a lot of phos in row. Soybeans are a little bit more sensitive to that. So they are more around 20 pounds per acre. And anything over that should be banded or applied, not seed row. The last thing with soybeans is also they are not particularly competitive when they start to emerge from the ground. So if you have high weed pressure, they won't be able to kind of be the most productive that they are meant to be. So you do want to consider those pre-emergent herbicides to have the field as clean as possible so that the soybeans are able to be as productive as possible. With any of the field management stuff, so insects, again, grasshoppers, aphids, cutworms, wireworms, seed corn maggots, spider mites, a lot of the ones that we see in the majority of our crops. It all just kind of comes down to which crop the insect wants more. I know with faba beans, they're kind of lower on the list compared to like peas, for example, where what crop the insect is going to go for first. But they all kind of are there and present and things that need to be managed. Diseases, you're likely going to have to do at least one fungicide application. It is very just important to scout and determine if it is a fungal disease or a bacterial blight. That will kind of dictate what different products you want to use. It is impacted by kind of all the normal ones, and root rot is there as well, that I will talk about in a second here, but not for Aphanomyces, which is good. There are a couple that are just primarily impacting soybeans. That includes that iron deficiency chlorosis that can show up in the fields depending on the environmental conditions. And then for weeds, there's lots of different options. It's pretty open there for what growers need to utilize. Here, I just want to again show the rotation option of why you want to include that if you have an Aphanomyces infected field. So this, as I said, is a non-host. It is safe to plant on even your worst Aphanomyces field, and you are able to continue to get the benefits of having a pulse crop in your rotation. Talking about diseases, so the one that I want to focus on today is the Phytophthora. So this is specific to soybeans, and one of the kind of big differences from a couple of the other root rot pathogens is that this can infect soybeans at any development stage. It is not just going for the freshly emerging crop. It can kind of pop up anytime in the season. Similar to Aphanomyces, it is an oocyte pathogen, so basically a water mold. It can just hang out and be dormant in the soil. Thankfully, seems to be a little bit less longevity compared to Aphanomyces, so around 4 years in the soil. It then releases those zoospores attracted to the roots, swim through the water that is in the soil, and infect those crops. Later in the season, if you get an infection, it can appear as that chocolate brown lesion that extends upward from the soil line. Sometimes it can develop on one side of the plant only. So again, it's all about being out there, scouting your field, and knowing what kind of conditions you're dealing with. If you dig up those roots, they will just kind of look rotten, discolored, very minimal nodulation. It's very likely going to be Phytophthora. And again, kind of with other root rots, a lot of time it is in patches, and with those compacted, heavy soils, that all kind of plays a part in it, as well as having that higher moisture in the soil so that the zoospores can swim around and infect the roots. For harvest, so soybeans are most commonly straight cut just because swathing increases the shattering losses, as well as being more prone to blowing because, as we know, in Saskatchewan, we have very windy days. And when you swath soybeans, you have to be quite low to the ground. There's just not much stubble to anchor them from that wind, like you would, say, canola that you can cut very high up. So that is definitely something to watch out for. When you're combining, kind of one of the things to watch out for is you want to be quite gentle with them. So you don't want them to get too dry because then as you go through the combine, there'll be shatter loss, the seeds will be splitting, and soybeans, as I've said, couple sensitivity issues. That comes down to harvest as well, where grading can be degraded just based on what the seeds are looking like as you're able to take them up. But other than that, pretty straightforward. A couple of kind of the benefits again is really that alternative herbicide, fungicide, all of those options compared to other pulse crops. Definitely, I will always say the Aphanomyces resistance and non-host crop is very beneficial to be able to fit that into your rotation. And obviously, getting new genetics, new varieties that are able to be more productive in Saskatchewan are really kind of what the growers want and what breeders are working on developing so that we are able to provide that to growers. As for the markets and end use for soybeans, as I keep saying, it's a very well developed market. Most of Canada's soybean production is exported, about 65% of that. China being the largest buyer of Canadian soybeans. And then we have Algeria, other countries in the Middle East, and then Asian countries as well. Majority of the crop does go to crush plants where soy oil is produced, and that soy meal is then given to livestock for feed. So that is a lot of the market there. But there's also in the States, they put a lot towards biofuels and then obviously human consumption as well. But I believe that is around 7% of the market. Advances in the plant breeding continue to bring soybeans into Saskatchewan, and it now ranks fourth amongst the Canadian principal crops in terms of acreage. So it does outrank corn, and the global soybean trade continues to increase with that high demand for both animal feed, biofuels, and human consumption. And with that, we'll go into some questions. Non-host for Aphanomyces, but what about other root? Yeah, so it is still susceptible to other root rots. We know in Saskatchewan, really, Aphanomyces is the most negatively impactful, especially because peas and lentils are the majority of the pulse acres in the province by a very large amount. So having that the soybeans and faba beans able to be fit into that rotation so that then peas and lentils can still be grown is kind of the important part of that resistance and being a non-host. Any difference between two different bradyrhizobia? Um, so yes, but specifics I don't know off the top of my head. I do know kind of it depends on there's various different companies that are producing these inoculants as to kind of like a specific what one does better than the other or not. I don't know off the top of my head. What are the biggest challenges of facing higher yields? Is it just lack of August rains or short season? Um, I would say for the most part, it is the length of the season that both faba beans and soybeans require. As for soybeans, very much is kind of those heat units, like we kind of why it's focused down in that southeast corner is just because they have that heavier, moister soil. So that's what the soybeans need, but also they get the heat units to be able to be as productive as they are, which we know, like looking at Manitoba, it's very um, wet and humid and gets that heat later in the summer. So that's kind of the biggest constraints there. What kind of quality losses are there from early frost? So for soybeans, it can be as long as they're not emerged, then they'll be fine. But because the growing point emerges out of the soil, that then can be killed off by a frost and is very susceptible to being just completely wiped out by that. Typically, it's kind of a less risk with soybeans just because you seed it a bit later, because it also needs that warm soil. But if by chance we get one of those crazy frosts that sometimes we get, it can be quite harmful to soybeans.
What about an early frost at harvest time and beans aren't quite ready?
Yeah, so for both fabas and soybeans, they typically aren't too impacted from what I think I've read. I do know, again, on the SPG website, we have a document talking about late season frost for soybeans in particular. I know I've read, so I can point you there. But I think from a quality standpoint, it's it's not too impactful. But don't quote me on that. I don't know off the top of my head.
We will gather up any relevant resources and include them in our post webinar email. So everyone attending today and everyone who is registered will receive a package shortly once the recording is. Any final takeaways you wanted to leave our audience with, Mark, before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining. And here's all our information. Obviously, you can reach out to myself and Mike if you have any questions and want to chat about any of the crops that we've talked about for the last 2 days. And yeah, just kind of, that's really it.